Hey everybody, and welcome to the 2025 Summer of Protocols Guest Talk Series, a weekly event where we explore the frontier of protocol studies with industry experts, founders, researchers, and other brilliant minds. And today's guest talk is with Venkatesh Rao, who has got his consultant and protocol fiction hat on, is going to talk to us about a protocol fiction protocol. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the sci-fi contest we're running, what we've done with the Protocolized magazine, and we're also going to hear from a couple of our contributing writers, Sachin and Travis, who are going to come on at the end after Venkat's spoken. I'm going to share a little bit about the contest that we have going right now, though, which is called the Terminological Twist Challenge, and that closes on April 15th. Basically, you want to start out with a engineering concept and reverse that into a story based on protocols. You can learn more on the website. I'll drop a link in the chat on YouTube. Anybody can apply. We have $6,000 in prizes, and anybody that makes it into the finals might get a chance to have their piece published in the magazine. Another important announcement, we have quietly extended the deadline for our curriculum development program. So you now have until the end of the week, April 5th at 12 noon UTC to apply to that. If you know any good teachers, be sure to pass it along to them. And here's what we have in store for our next guest talks. Next week, Nadia Asparova is going to come on for a fireside chat about her upcoming book on anti-memetics, which is going to be very interesting. We have a guest talk about protocols in general. It's from Ram Kannan, who is the founder and CEO of EigenLayer. April 23rd, we have a top secret guest, in other words, to be determined. And April 30th, we have a guest talk with Emmett Shear, who is the former CEO of Twitch and the former interim CEO of OpenAI. So with all that, I'm going to pass it off to Venkat, who is today's guest speaker, a consultant, the blogger of Ruin Farm, which is now called Contraptions, and who is directing the SOP program.
All right. So yeah, today I'm going to try and do a talk with my personal hat on, not as a program director of Summer Protocols. What you're seeing in the background behind me is the art at this hotel I'm at, which is kind of appropriate. It's the Kabuki Hotel in Japantown in San Francisco. I'm here for some work, and just so happened that I ended up staying at this hotel. And of course, as many of you know, Kabuki is a classical form of Japanese theater, which is appropriate for the theme of protocol fiction. So this is going to be kind of an informal stream of consciousness kind of talk, and I have an outline I've worked out. I'm not going to use slides, but I will use an outline, and we'll try a talk show type format. I'll talk for about 20 minutes maybe, then we'll bring on a couple of people who've been experimenting with the idea of protocol fiction, and see if we can have a nice discussion here. So let me share my outline, and there's a reason I'm doing it this way, which I'll share in a second. Let's see. Yeah, so if you can see my screen, Timber, can you put my screen share up? Yes, thank you. All right. So I created a new Roam graph on my account for protocol fiction, because what we are trying to do in SOP, and I'm personally very interested in, is kind of try and kick off a new genre of science fiction, which we are calling protocol fiction. And it would feel ironic if I just made up my own definition of what that means and kind of like gave a big speech about it. So what I'd like to try and do is use today's talk to feed kind of more collaborative effort. So this is my opinion on what protocol fiction is and how I think it should evolve. And hopefully several people who will be contributing to the Protocolized magazine and to stuff we are doing this year, they'll have their own takes, and maybe we'll come up with like sort of a decentralized understanding of what protocol fiction is. Okay. So all this really started for me about uh, 6 months ago, I think, when I came across a bunch of speeches and essays by Ted Chiang, the science fiction writer. He's written collections like Exhalation is my favorite one, though he's written several others. Uh, and he offered a definition of science fiction which I thought was really clever, which was that, so I'm sort of paraphrasing for compactness. Um, the rule basically is that science fiction is about strange rules, whereas fantasy is about special people. And this definition really stuck with me because it's a cleaner, more fundamental distinction than thinking about science fiction as spaceships and time travel and parallel universes, and fantasy as being about wizards and dragons and so forth. This idea that science fiction is about special rules and fantasy about special people, specifically, chosen ones like Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker. So that's what I mean by special people. People who kind of have this uh, story going on, that they're somehow special, that they're picked out by the universe to fulfill a special destiny. And the story is about them kind of like realizing their special destiny. And you might think this is kind of just silly, childish fantasy ways of thinking. But actually, if you talk to people, a lot of people think about their lives this way. One of my favorite books about narrative is by a narrative psychologist named Dan McAdams, who wrote this book called The Redemptive Self, who did research and found out that Americans in particular, so I presume that means United States, not Canada, this doesn't sound Canadian, but Americans as in United States, they kind of believe this about their life stories, that somehow they're born into slightly privileged circumstances where they're somehow different from others. And there's like this moment when somebody spots their potential, like, Gandalf telling Frodo he's chosen in a way. Uh, and then they go on to have kind of like a hero's journey type special chosen person adventure. And that's how the story goes. And a lot of Americans actually think of their life this way. And there's a reason I picked Frodo as an example. A lot of people complained recently when I said the Lord of the Rings is this kind of story, because Frodo in many ways is the opposite of a typical classical hero. In fact, Frodo is, some people say that Tolkien came up with the Lord of the Rings as almost the opposite of the ring cycle of Wagner, which has more of a classical hero. Uh, but it's still kind of special. Like, he's a hobbit from like not a special place, but somehow he becomes the one who's destined to carry the ring to Mount Doom and so forth, right? So this is fantasy. And science fiction is about strange rules. And Ted Chiang's point is, let me see if I think I expanded that somewhere. So, yeah, Ted Chiang's point, the broader point is that science fiction is in many ways the literature of change. Science fiction is how we think about not just how the world changes, but how we change in response to the world changing, right? And if you think about it, this is not actually something that all stories do. So take the classical hero's journey. So you've got this, the famous line from Batman: "You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain." That's kind of the hero-villain arc of like the hero's journey. But the interesting thing is that the hero might change in a way defined purely by internal spiritual growth, like growing into their destiny as a chosen one. But they don't really change in response to things happening in the world, right? Like, they're not like, this historic event happened or this new technology was discovered and I'm going to like change myself in response to that. So the heroic theory of change is actually not a theory of change at all as far as the human is concerned. It's a reactionary response to the world changing. And usually the response to the change is, we used to be in a golden age and we are all going to hell, and the hero is one who's kind of like resisting that change. So it tends to be kind of like a right-leaning reactionary way of like comprehending change. And if you look towards more like what you might think of as left-leaning or progressive models of change, they're actually not that much better. So Ursula Le Guin who's kind of like my idea of the prototypical alternate to the hero's journey, she came up with this idea of the carrier bag theory of fiction, which is more about like instead of individual heroic figures going and slaying dragons, it's more about communities, groups of people who are like uh, tied together in webs of mutualism and interdependence, and they kind of like change together. So they kind of like bring change about in effectively like an anarchist socialist way. So a lot of her novels are about that. But you read kind of between the lines, and this also, to me at least, seems kind of left reactionary instead of right reactionary. And instead of like an individual being the hero going and slaying dragons, it ends up being a community of people, sort of like self-effacing people, together reinforcing a condition of changelessness. And this shows up even in her novels. Like her most famous novel is probably Dispossessed, and The Planet of Anaris, if I'm getting that right. It's a twin planet system. That's kind of like a anarchic left socialist planet, but the story is about a physicist named Shevek who comes up with a theory of like faster than light communication, and he has to go to the patriarchal and hierarchical twin planet of Uras to actually pursue his dream. So in a way, she kind of like backslides into a hero's journey type story in that famous novel. And another famous one is The Left Hand of Darkness, which is another of my favorites. And this is set on a planet where it's literally an unchanging year one, year after year. So nothing changes. So I love Ursula Le Guin's stories, but I think of it as like just, the hero's journey with extra steps and like a collective as the hero. So how do you actually accommodate change in a really positive way? And this is what I think of as almost a third theory of fiction, maybe all of fiction, but specifically science fiction. So you've got the heroic theory of change, which is not really science fiction at all, it's fantasy. So even if you have like, Luke Skywalker flying around in space and spacecraft with lightsabers, it's a fantasy story because it's a chosen one story and nothing really changes. But yeah, protocol theories of change, and we'll get into some examples of what I mean by that. So this I think of as it's neither about the sovereign heroic individual, nor is it about the intersubjective community evolving together. It's about both those things. Both those things do happen, but it's mainly about both the objective and subjective changing together, like technology happening, and instead of saying this is like decline and fall and everything good and human is declining, you kind of lean into it and say, hey, this is an opportunity to transform. It's an opportunity for us to transform as a species and become very different. So that I think is kind of fundamentally the thing that protocol fiction is really good at, and science fiction in general, science fiction proper in Ted Chiang's sense of strange rules rather than special people. That's what science fiction at its best is really good at. So why is this interesting now? I think science fiction as a theory of change is the single best way for the average human to really engage with the question of what is happening around us in the environment and how do we respond to it, right? And we are in one such like critical change period right now. We've got AI, we've got climate, we've got cryptography. These are kind of the forces we think about a lot in the summer protocols, but it's all coming and changing the world. And you could have the hero's journey response of I'm going to compete with the AI, or I'm going to like retreat from blockchains into gold, or I'm going to like create a little village that survives climate change. You could have that reactionary model. You can have the left sort of left-leaning version of that as well. But the better question to ask is, these technologies are not just changing the world, they're actually changing us. And kind of understanding that change and leaning into it is kind of the key of what I'm getting at here. Hold on, let me shut down my Discord here. Okay, so I want to give you some precedents to think about. I might end up taking more than 20 minutes. Sorry, guys. Okay, so three of my big talking points. Okay, so the big point I want to make is fiction, if you put fiction movements in historical time, so not in their internal world building time, but in historical times, you can see them as movements in response to particular historical moments that cause metamorphosis in humans' understanding of themselves, what humans think they are, right? And I want to give you a few examples of that. So the first one is not science fiction proper, though it led to science fiction, but basically modernist literature. So the kind of manifesto of this movement was this extraordinary essay written by Virginia Woolf called Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, where she talks about a style of literature that was very externally oriented, like about the world, and people were really caricatures. And this was, late Victorian, Edwardian eras. And she and her peers in what was known as the Bloomsbury set, they innovated a whole new way of thinking about literature, which was very internally directed. So very subjectivity and interiority framed. And her famous novel, Mrs. Dalloway, really brings this out. So this is completely the stream of consciousness of one woman going through her day, planning a party in the evening. But it's all about the time you live in, the temporality you inhabit is inside Mrs. Dalloway's head. But periodically it gets interrupted by the sound of Big Ben, the clock in London tolling, right? So it's a very interesting structure. And this was her sort of fictional attempt to get at how is technology in the 1910s and 1920s changing us. It's flipping us from externally oriented people like the Mr. Bennett in the essay and turning us into internally focused people. So this, of course, gave birth to the entire modernist movement, along with other famous poets and writers, T.S. Eliot and others. And it gave rise to magic realism, a whole new way of like being human. And this is far more influential than many of us realize, even though it's kind of like a high literary kind of movement. So that's one example. A more pop culture example, if you look at the evolution of murder mysteries, so I have a great book about this. It's The Theory and Practice of Classic Detective Fiction, I think. But it provides this very interesting timeline where each era of detective fiction, which is a very modern kind of phenomenon, like the idea of a police force and a private detective or amateur detective working with the police, sometimes against them, it's only about 150 years old because modern police forces are only about that old. But yeah, the first era is called cozy fiction. That's where you get like, the body in the library kind of story. And here you have an archetype of the human as what's usually called the ratiocinative or the rational detective, somebody who's really good at, deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning, and it represents a new kind of human who thinks a particular way. And this is Sherlock Holmes is a classic example, and Hercule Poirot is another. But it's also interesting to look at their protocol counterparts. So these are maverick heroic figures. So this is heroic fiction, kind of fantasy in that sense. But it's really interesting that the stories only work because you've got these more protocol-like figures in the background, like, Inspector Lestrade in the Holmes stories and Inspector Japp in the Poirot stories. And you see the same pattern, like the gritty, hard-boiled era. Philip Marlowe is a good example of the hard-boiled era of fiction. You have these like gritty, tough characters, but they're surrounded by kind of like people playing more trope-like roles. They're like, colorful characters from mid-century. Then you have the psychological era, typically like serial killer type stories. Again, you have like, very protocolish figures chasing down the crazy nuts who are going around serial killing. So you kind of have this tension between a weird heroic figure and a backdrop of protocol type people who are part of institutions trying to keep up. Two more points in that evolution. I really like Dirk Gently, who's Douglas Adams' detective, and Dirk Gently's famous catchphrase was referencing Sherlock Holmes, is that Sherlock Holmes says that when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, has to be true. And Dirk Gently said, I don't like eliminating the impossible. And that's kind of his thing. So his stories have this, they look like fantasy because there's like ghosts and gods and time travel and all sorts of weird things happening. But Dirk Gently, I think, is the beginning of more protocolish detectives. And again, he represents a particular kind of human being who merges both the heroic figure as well as the sort of background protocol figure, but he's characterized by thinking about the world in post-rational ways. So he's not like Holmes and Poirot. And of course, in the modern era, it's been dominated by what we all know as procedural crime, right? It's mainly it's a television medium more than written. So CSI, Law and Order, that kind of show. So that's cozy murder mysteries. Science fiction, again, has a similar evolution. So the astounding golden age era of science fiction, so Asimov, Heinlein, and people like that, they proposed that this is like, I think, true science fiction in the sense of like, about strange rules as opposed to special people. the heroes of Asimov typically are not chosen one or special people types. The only special person or chosen person in all of Asimov, in my opinion, is actually the robot continuity character, Daniel Oliver. So it's kind of funny that a robot is like almost a product of protocols. So it's a very mechanical, computational idea, and he's the only chosen one hero through the entire Asimov universe. Everybody else is kind of like just a I don't know, everyday grunt. Like they're smart, they're like competent and stuff. So they still continue the competent man trope of Asimov era, but it's they're part of systems. There's stories about systems and how the world changes and how humans change as part of that system. I won't spend too much time through the rest. Many of you know the history of science fiction better than me, but yeah, you can kind of just map it out. As eras of science fiction evolved, each age proposed kind of like a prototype of what does it mean to be human in this era. And there's always a tension between the chosen one heroic archetype version of the human in that era and sort of the transformed human who's a product of the protocols and technologies of that era. So Philip K. Dick is kind of interesting. So you do have heroes who, like, Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. The hero is somewhere in between, like, classic fantasy heroes, chosen one, and kind of like a protocol figure of like he's never quite sure whether he's a replicant or not. That's kind of one of the tensions of that story, right? So already the figure is fading into the background, and you kind of see this continuing. So cyberpunk has this archetype of hero who is like high tech and low life, but we're very far from kind of like the chosen one script here. These people are typically just competent, skilled people hacking away at the underbelly of technologies, and I think in contemporary fiction we've basically gone all the way. Like the chosen one, great man type hero stories, at least for the science fiction enthusiasts among us, they don't resonate anymore. We kind of want humans who kind of reflect how humanity is changing through fiction. And this is admittedly a minority viewpoint. Like if you look at sales figures, fantasy vastly outsells science fiction, and especially a particular genre called romantasy, I believe. So I'm not a huge fan. I read some fantasy, but I'm basically a science fiction guy. And in contemporary science fiction, in what I would call proper protocol fiction, I would definitely put Quantum's book, There Is No Anti-Memetics Division, which actually came out of this online fiction collective called SCP. I think that stands for Secure Protect something. But yeah, there's a wiki about it, and we have a really great guest talk about that in our archives by Simon de la Riviere. This is classic protocol fiction. This is kind of the model I kind of aspire to. So that's kind of the evolutionary track of how protocol fiction explores strange new rules and how humans change in those strange new rules. So I want to give you like a quick sketch of a theory I'm starting to form of how all this works. We have a whole, I started a stub page of examples and counterexamples, but basically I think protocols can show up in fiction in three ways. First is protocols can actually be part of the authoring processes, right? So SCP, I already mentioned, it's an online collective of people who play by certain rules and write like a huge growing Wikipedia of fun science fiction. Another one I want to pick out is Ian M. Banks, whose one novel is exceptional. It was the first one I read, called Use of Weapons. And his process is he's got alternating chapters, one half of which go forward from the start and another half kind of goes backwards from the end, and they sort of meet in the middle. It's a very clever sort of mechanistic way of writing, and it shows up in the nature of the story as well. Caesar, I won't say more about that. One of our guests, Sachin, who's going to come on, he might have more to say about that. But this is what I mean by protocols in the authoring process, and LLMs, which we'll talk about, kind of fit into this aspect of how protocols show up in fiction. Then, of course, you've got protocols as central theme. Severance, the hit TV show going on right now, I think it's right in the middle of like protocol fiction. Asimov's Three Laws of Robotics, it's complete protocol fiction because every story is about like, how much can you stretch or break the three laws. And one that just occurred to me is that I think almost all Christopher Nolan movies are protocol fiction because he's usually doing something playing with how time unfolds in narrative. So these are three examples of protocols as a central theme. And finally, protocols as like, not the main show, but kind of like a major background element or plot device. And my example here is the Foundation Saga, right? You've got psychohistory, you've got the time vault, you've got Harry Seldon's hologram showing up and like talking about Seldon crisis. But the whole story in the background is about the psychohistorical process. In a way, the star of the show of the Foundation Saga is the prime radiant, which is the device that sort of keeps history on track, right? The individual humans are just circling around what the prime radiant does, and none of them is like the fantasy hero of like chosen ones. They're all kind of like somehow coming out of the math equations that they happen to play the right role at the right time in the story of history. So those are the three ways protocols can show up in fiction. Okay, I want to make a couple of remarks here. Just one remark, actually. I have been thinking a lot about what protocol fiction isn't. And I think just having genre conventions does not make it protocol fiction. Like, is a cozy murder mystery where there's a body in a library and Sherlock Holmes goes figures it out? Is that protocol fiction simply because there's a lot of conventions that genre follows? I think not. I think we have to draw a tighter boundary than that. I think it's more like the protocols that show up in the story should in some way reflect the changes going on in the world around you. So whether it shows up in your method, whether you use LLMs to tell your story, or whether it shows up in the theme of your story itself, in some way, the protocols show up because they're helping you understand change in the world. So if that's not happening, you're just kind of playing a little game on the side that has nothing to do with what's happening in the world. So cozy murder mysteries of the Sherlock Holmes type, yes, they had a little bit to do with the world because we were getting into, mid-modernity. Everybody was being rational and rationality was on the upswing, and the heroes of those detective stories were super rational. And the locked library mystery is kind of a showcase for deductive and inductive and abductive reasoning, right? It's a very mathematically closed playground. So there is a connection. There is a connection to what was going on in the world in the 1920s and so forth, but it's not a strong one. Um, Whereas there is no anti-memetics division, for example, I think is an amazingly relevant kind of fiction because it really gets at our social media environment. How do you deal with disinformation? Should you hide from the public information sphere? How do you make a thing that does not propagate at all? So this is kind of almost a preview of Nadia's talk next week, and you should all buy her book when it comes out. It's amazing, but I won't go too much into that. But I'll end with well, I went over, but yeah, I want to invite all of you to participate in this project we're trying to kick off here of trying to make protocol fiction a thing, like figure out the theory of it, the mechanics of it, write it, learn how to write it with and without LLMs. And we're starting to do a bunch of experiments. We ran a couple of workshops and we'll get people on to talk about it. But this is a stub of a Rome database. Get on our Discord. The link will be there. Right now it's read only for everybody, but if you want edit access, message me and I'll add you. Let's figure this out. I think this is a fascinating new genre we can create together. I'll stop sharing this. I'll reshare again, but yeah, let's switch into a little bit more of a panel mode. I only went 8 minutes long. Yeah, so Timber, can we have Travis on?
Yeah, Travis is just getting set up, and
or whoever's ready.
I think he's ready to go. So,
all right.
Travis, welcome to the stage.
All right. Welcome aboard, Travis. So Travis was in the first protocol science fiction workshop we did in Austin about a month ago, and he came up with what I think is the cleverest protocols for writing science fiction with LLM help. So yeah, Travis, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and like saying a little bit about how you did that story, which is being published right now in Protocolized. Oh, you're muted, I think. Okay, there you go.
That'll help. I've been building software for decades, spent a lot of time in innovation consulting, And over the past 5 years, I really went deep into contributing to crypto projects and built an NFT marketplace and a DAO platform. And most recently, I've been focused on decentralized social media and artificial intelligence. You're muted now. Yeah, and so I got exposed to the protocol fiction, summer of protocols early when they started put together the first cohort, and just kind of followed the research ever since, and saw that you were conducting a workshop in Austin, and so wasn't going to miss that. And what we did is kind of come in on the first day and discuss a lot of the topics we just covered about what protocol fiction is, what protocol fiction could be. From that, I kind of took all of my notes and compiled them into what I have used as my protocol fiction writing framework. And from that framework, I decided, and it was one of the things we were to explore that week, to experiment with large language models. And so also been very active in Warpcast and Farcaster recently, and reading some Dan Simmons' work. I decided I wanted to take the end of the Hyperion Cantos as kind of my inspiration for the world, and where that would begin. So I did a lot of research into Dan Simmons and his writing styles, and started working with ChatGPT to come up with some ideas for a story. And ChatGPT put the brakes on really fast and said that it wasn't able to do something along those lines because of copyright issues and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, this is not how this needs to work. And so I went over to Claude, and I asked the exact same question, and Claude just started spitting out, slop. And I was like, okay, cool. I like where this is going. And it finished with a bunch of questions for where I wanted to go to next. And I started by, trying to be the good participant and answering the questions. And I was like, no, I'm going to take these questions and I'm going to give them to the other LLM. So I took the questions and I gave it to ChatGPT. Of course, it responded with a pretty good response. And it ended with a bunch more questions. So I took those questions and I moved them over back into Claude. And I just ended up kind of starting, this process. And I got more and more involved as it went on, but that was a really good kind of way to initiate, what I was working on, and for me to kind of start thinking about things in a different way.
Timber, can you throw up my shared screen for a second? I want to point people. So this is the part one of that story that came out of the process, right?
It is.
We're calling it the entropic gate now. So the process Travis described of ping-ponging call and response between Claude and ChatGPT. That's a fascinating protocol, and the story itself is about protocols. I'm getting Seinfeld coffee table book about coffee tables kind of vibes here. But let me ask you a quick question. If you had to add one more book to the, let me share my examples and counterexamples. Oops, sorry. Hold on just a sec. While I bring that back up, what one more classic protocol fiction would you add to this list I have going?
Well, it's a tough question. And I'm glad you kind of already touched on Heinlein from the Golden Age and Le Guin from the Silver Age, because both of those authors have been very meaningful to me. But you didn't get specific in the cyberpunk. And that was kind of what flipped my lid on fiction, just in general. And so I would want to make sure we add Neuromancer. Might be a little, a little obvious, but that's where the term cyberspace comes from. So we might say it's related to transmission control protocol, internet protocol, TCP/IP.
All right, let's add it right now. All right. I had one more question, and then we'll bring on Sachin. You already had three questions. What one book would you add? And you added Neuromancer. I already asked the question, what's your one weird LLM trick? And it's just Claude GPT ping pong. The third question I have is, what protocol fiction story would you like to write, but currently feels beyond your ability?
Well, I'm a DAO nerd, and so I'd like to write a protocol fiction exploring the evolution of governance of protocols, and maybe something that examines decentralized governance structures and a form that how it would be in practice rather than theory. Maybe a technological Animal Farm where the initial premise of all users have equal votes gradually transforms into, something much different, which I think is what we're experiencing, in that space right now. There are emergent powers, there are coordination problems that create new hierarchies. The challenge is we haven't seen successful models of protocol governance. So we really don't know what that might look like, and convincing or creating a convincing narrative where governance mechanisms evolve with social dynamics and technical constraints and economic incentives. That requires an imagination I have yet to invoke.
Yeah, this is, I think DAOs, since they've gone through like the peak of inflated expectations, and then everybody was super disappointed with like how badly they behaved in the last few years. And I think they're kind of recovering a little bit now. I do think Byzantine Empathy by Ken Liu, it's one of the few pure blockchain-y stories. It kind of almost gestures at that, but I did want to quickly flash this other screen. So if you go to not this one, sorry, where am I? Short story archives. Yeah, this one. So if you go to summerprotocols.com and click on research and then click on the tab or tag for short stories, you'll find a bunch. And I believe the caucus is actually a story about liquid democracy, caucus voting governance. So yeah, we already have people trying this, but I think, this is going to be a hard kind of story to tell. But with that, let's bring Sachin Benny on. And Travis, you should stay on. So yeah, let's just add Sachin to the deck.
Hey.
All right, Sachin. So same three questions for you in order. First, introduce yourself, and you just published a new book, so shill that. And second, what one book would you add to our canon? Third, what's your one weird LLM-ish trick? And what was my third question? I'm a bad talk show host. What story would you like to write but currently seems beyond your capacity? So a lot to keep in mind, but start with the introduction and your book.
Hey, I'm Sachin, and I've been a contributor to Protocolized and also contributed a story to Summer Protocols last year. And I have a book of essays out called Thinking About Leaving. And it's basically a collection of essays that I wrote over the last 2 years, mostly sort of moving between my life in the US, where I moved to 8 years ago, and growing up in India. So you should buy and read it. But to the prompts,
Timber, can we quickly share that? Yeah, this is Sachin's book, Thinking About Living. It's amazing. You should buy it and read it. All right.
The prompts. One book to add. I just recently started reading Dracula, the Bram Stoker version, and I don't know why I didn't know this, but basically the whole book unfolds in letters and telegrams, and it's mostly sort of like communication materials of that era, like newspaper stories and telegrams and letters between people. And there was I was looking into this, and there was a Substack that did sort of a series where they would send you a chapter on the exact date that it's mentioned in the book. So if a letter says May 6th, you would get the newsletter with that chapter on May 6th. And there's also and I kind of feel so. I guess it's essentially sort of protocols within fiction itself, and a newer version of it, which I did not really enjoy, was I think it was called Several People Typing, which was basically a novel that unfolded in Slack messages. But both of these sort of like use sort of contemporary protocols of communication to tell the story, and I don't know, it sort of like reveals interesting details. I had one more that came to my mind while Venkat was speaking, was sort of like fantasy versus science fiction, and it sort of made me think of like Aesop's fables versus like fairy tales. Like fairy tales, especially like newer adaptations of it, are like very sort of hero centric, especially like post Disney. While Aesop fables has sort of like both sort of like the subjective and objective change that Venkat is talking about. Like it's not like the tortoise and hare is not exactly about the tortoise and hare. It also has like a moral to the story and everything. And I think it's kind of interesting how like those kind of like folk tales are not as popular. Like you could say that the fairy tale stories are much more popular than the sort of like folk tale like stories, and I don't know what exactly it is. I mean, maybe it has something to do with like it seems like something along the lines of the protocols that we have in our day-to-day life is very complex. So maybe people sort of like seek simplicity in the fairy tale like stories. I'm not sure, but
The tortoise and hare that you mentioned, it's interesting that yes, it's kind of a protocol story in the sense of a race with two different strategies, but it's also interesting that the moral sounds like a good engineering heuristic, like slow and steady wins the race. Sounds like it's a heuristic of how to design systems, not how to be a heroic turtle or hare, right? It's a rule that anybody can adopt in certain situations. Yeah, and you're right. Fairy tales kind of don't have that. They have that happily ever after, unchanging return model. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I just one more thought on that direction was basically if there is only a subjective change happening within a story, then the story is sort of tragic. Like basically, Kafkaesque stories where you come up against a protocol and the person sort of like gives up or like is sort of like beaten into submission, or a lot of stories and movies that sort of like frame the postmodern the condition of man or something. It's sort of like it's very you're shown the subjective change of like technology or cities becoming bigger and the person sort of like getting defeated. So there's no the change. The person almost doesn't change while their subjective environment changes.
This reminds me of like the classical Greek idea of tragedy was built around the notion of hamartia, right? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but Hamartia. So hamartia is this notion of like it actually went through an evolution. Initially, in the classical Greek context, it was basically like due to some random bullshit event in the environment, a series of very unfortunate events is triggered, and a noble person basically comes to a fall in a way that they have no control over. This is the classic Greek tragedy. But through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, it started acquiring a moral tone, and the idea of hamartia became the idea of like a fatal moral flaw in your personality. And that version of it says that maybe you're like this great man who everybody admires, but deep down you have like this fatal flaw, and that's your undoing. And I think we kind of keep rehearsing this pattern. Even the postmodern thing you mentioned, it sounds like Hamartia with extra steps of that kind of thing. That's a good point. It's like subjectively changes, but it has like basically no correlation to like historic change in the environment, but it's almost like a random walk into misfortune or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
What's your one weird LLM trick?
um, I don't have many, but like I sort of like speak to it in sort of like a stream of conscious way. And one thing I've started doing is this is not a weird trick, but I get, I get ideas when I'm driving. So now I use the voice chat on ChatGPT to sort of like speak to it, and it's much easier for me to get like raw ideas out there that are like a voice note will be like 5 minutes long or something, and it's pretty good at figuring out my accent and everything. So basically, I've been doing that a lot. In fact, I think the next protocolized story that I'll be writing started off as notes that I basically voice recorded on while driving. So yeah, not a weird trick, but pretty useful, I guess.
I think that actually does qualify as a weird trick because so far we've been treating LLMs as almost a voice to text or text to voice, like very straightforward transition. But that's not how humans use spoken language, right? It's like we are inside each other's OODA loops and like reacting to each other in real time. And I think in short order, we'll have like beyond podcasts, kind of like a interactive version. You'll be talking to ChatGPT while driving, but ChatGPT will be talking back, and it'll be more like an improv theater performance that then turns into a story, right? So we can
Right.
imagine things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like basically my idea is sort of like I always, this kind of sound slightly sad in some ways because it's like I've always wanted like a writing partner of some kind, like all those writer duos. I've always like fascinated to be like, oh, maybe I can find somebody because I sort of work well when I can like bounce ideas quickly, and this is like my way of hacking it in some way. But yeah, I guess the last prompt was.
What would you like to write that so far seems beyond your ability, and maybe LLMs will get you there?
This was something I was talking to Timber about last time around. And this is not exactly writing, but basically, I saw two really short documentaries recently. One was about basically there's this practice of people in Mexico sending care packages to people in Venezuela, because like in Venezuela everything is really like expensive. So people in Mexico who they get in touch with put up these large care packages that have like daily things like moisturizer, soap, things like that, and send it back to Venezuela. And the documentary is framed in such a way that you don't see the people at all. You just see the packages being assembled, the hands moving, people talking about the hassle of getting this thing from Mexico to Venezuela. And I think that's all like it was very interesting to me because it's on one hand it's like it's basically the normal protocols have collapsed in Venezuela, like businesses, governments, and then there is this sort of like care package protocol that has taken over, and the movie sort of like does a good job of framing that in the center. So I was thinking it would be nice to do like short videos about like protocols that can be visualized. I don't know how to go about it or anything, but that's something I've heard that's aspirational.
This immediately reminds me, I just added it to our examples list. It immediately reminds me of the Tim O'Brien classic short story called The Things They Carried. So there's an entire short story that's basically about, I think, a military unit that's out in Vietnam or something. And the story just goes through like the things the various soldiers are carrying. So it's like care package kind of like way of like getting at it. And I was just thinking, this is actually a very good lens into people's protocol lives. Like on the flight here to San Francisco from Seattle, suddenly it struck me that, hey, I forgot my laptop charger. And then I dug into the front pocket of my backpack, and I found that I actually was carrying a spare cable that'll connect to my phone charger. And I remember I had started doing that the last time I forgot my charger. So in a way, my backpack is already a little bit of a protocol story unfolding, right? So I think this is kind of an interesting class of techniques, both methodologically, like looking at like this Mexico Venezuela kind of thing, as well as like it gives you content to talk about and a process to talk about it. So yeah, Tim O'Brien short story, the things they carried. But let's add Timber to the mix, since Timber has been running a little bit of a reading group and surveying protocol fiction. Yeah, so Timber.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of protocol fiction meetups and talking with Sachin a lot, and another guy, Nathan, who's worked with the program. And I think it's a really promising subgenre of science fiction, protocol fiction, because it like you talked about, Venkat, in your seminal essay for this year's program, about how so much of the stories we tell are focused on great men and great bureaucrats, and this focus on high agency individuals who just do things, then everybody else has to bear the consequences. But to add one book to the canon, one of my favorite books is The Martian, and I think that's a particular subgenre of protocol fiction where it's kind of like survival, and there's survival horror, and there's like kind of like Riddick is horror, survival, sci-fi, but Riddick is a superhero, but the guy who's in The Martian is just an astronaut. And yeah, he's above average intelligence and capable beyond most people because he made it through all those training programs. But he's not like Ender in Ender's Game. Like, he's just a normal human being that has like good problem solving skills, a background in botany, and a background in engineering, which happens to be the right mix for the environment he's in. So, and it really shows you the process he goes through of testing hypotheses, documenting stuff along the way. It's really good.
Since you brought up The Martian, I'm just reminded of like something somebody said about Matt Damon, that he's the person movies have spent the most money rescuing from weird situations in movies ever. Like, he's Private Ryan and Saving Private Ryan. He's the guy stranded in Interstellar that they go try to rescue. So a lot of his The Martian, of course, is one of those as well. So it's interesting. Like he does have his superhero stuff as well. Like the Bourne trilogy is kind of like special person story. But even that's kind of protocolish. Like, he's a trained product of like a CIA secret agent program. And what makes the Bourne trilogy special is that he's lost his memory, right? It's sort of like a protocolish premise. But yeah, I think Matt Damon, maybe if we start giving out awards to like, the best protocol hero, which is slightly ironic, Matt Damon should receive the first one.
Yeah, he's looking at quite the tab.
Can you put the share screen back on the screen? Yeah, so maybe you guys can all chime in. I started doing this a couple of days ago. So I made a start here page. So this is my talk. You saw the outline. I have a bunch of references that we've collected over the years. There's a couple of great summer protocols talks here that you should check out. These are some of the early, like bureaucratic heroism is a classic essay that inspired this program. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, this is, AI cookbook. We should start populating this with our techniques for doing AI-assisted fiction. But the one I wanted to talk about is, that's the title of today's session, which is Protocol Fiction Protocol. So again, it's like, I could make up a list of like 50 rules, but it would be more fun to have like a whole bunch of us like, propose them and vote on them and see what makes sense. So these are what I have so far. You guys have any suggestions for things to add? So the first one is the first two are kind of like preliminaries. So examples over doctrines, as in like, let's do protocol fiction by identifying lots of like examples and retconning them into our canon, but also like, our own work, we should be like putting stories as in front of rules. The second one is like, tensions more than rules. And this list itself respects that. Everything is in the form of like A greater than B. So it's on a tension spectrum and we are picking an opinion on that spectrum. So it's kind of a little meta. But yeah, number 3 is the Ted Chiang law, which is strange rules over special people. Number 4 is the Fred Pohl law of write stories about traffic jams, not automobiles. So this comes from, let me click here. So I'm trying to make this kind of a future wiki. But yeah, the task of the science fiction writer is to predict the traffic jam, not the automobile. Yeah, so.
I have one which is kind of like a riff on strange rules over strange people, which if you've watched Rick and Morty, there's an episode where there's a character named Protagonist, and his special ability is that he can turn anybody in the show into the main character. And if you're able to do that without changing the plot significantly, it's protocol fiction. But like, if you look at The Boys, the reason The Boys works as a show is it changes the main characters from like the superhero to like the average people that get run over by like the Bolt when he like, or the Flash when he goes too fast and he kills somebody. And it totally dismantles the entire premise of the story.
There's a thread there. I think, maybe Sachin, you can speak to it since you've delved a lot into metamodernism. In a lot of ways, metamodernist fiction is protocol fiction, would you say? Like they go to this abstract level and play with the tropes of the lower level.
Yeah. It seems like it. I mean, I think some of the popular examples we have used is the Nathan Fielder show, The Rehearsal, which is essentially sort of, or most of his work is essentially playing with the protocols of producing reality shows or producing media and how people normally perceive them. In fact, I think he has like in one interview, he mentions something like, I think this was after his first show came out, and he was asked why, like what inspired him. And he said, and I don't know how true this is, but he says something like, when I was like reading about the 2008 financial collapse, it just seemed like it was a bunch of people just saying yes to anything that anybody told them. And he got this idea that people will say yes to anything if you just put a camera and tell them that they're on television. And so he sort of like, and so that's basically his sort of the sort of core improv thing that he starts from, I guess. But but I guess it's been a common trope in metamodern, like a lot of metamodernist work, that you sort of play with the tropes of the medium and sort of make fun of it. And I'm not sure how new it is, because I think in an essay that Venkat refers, I think in the paper, the David Foster Wallace, TV's influence on fiction, he talks about how Hollywood likes to make fun of itself, or in the 90s, there were so many ads that made fun of ads themselves, which you still have, like with like Geico and stuff like that. It's been a sort of common trope in some ways, I guess.
I think going meta, as in metamodernism, often has like an implicit commitment to a medium through which you go meta, right? Like television as one medium, you see yourself on TV, and that kind of sets off a meta loop. So Travis, I actually want to put you on the expert stool here, since you've actually dabbled the most in crypto. What is going meta in crypto look like? Like we talk a lot about composability and lore and like narrative elements of crypto culture. Is there a rule we can distill from there for our protocol here?
What does going meta in crypto look like?
NFT collections, lore, composability. It feels like there's something there that can belong in this list somehow.
Yeah, no, I mean, the metadata is important to the provenance of NFTs, right? And that is something that goes along to describe that artifact. One of the issues is sometimes that can actually be changed. And if the metadata can be changed, and say the path to the image representing that NFT is part of that metadata. Whoever wrote that contract, or whoever has control to update that contract, can actually replace that image. So something that somebody that, you know, thought that they owned or purchased in one form can actually change forms beyond their control. So there's something interesting there.
That sounds almost like a hackable story. Like, you know, you can write a story where somebody can go change some element that something else is pointing to. It's like, you know, vandalism in Wikipedia type situation. But I think, yeah, there's like possibilities for structured experiments with sort of like the technical sense of meta pointing to the cultural sense of meta in crypto.
And another thing I've been thinking about
Yep.
pretty often is how organizations can share prompts or share context, and that becomes something that can be voted on by the organization, and it doesn't always have to be the way that it is when it's decided. It can be changed, and that's part of like the historical evolution of an organization, is, you know, what that shared context is, what prompts they're using for text, for images, and stuff along those lines.
It's the AI equivalent of like commit messages in GitHub almost. It's like, yeah, the meta layer that made the main layer come up. We're just over time, but maybe we have time for one question. I see an interesting one from Tom Henderson. Can you put that up on screen, Timber? And maybe we can do two if there's another one. Yeah.
Is that the one about the protagonist?
Yeah. So I think this is actually a proposal for a rule to add here. Yeah, I think this is actually a good point somewhere here. Like, I think protocol fiction has a lot of the agency outside the protagonist. Like, the protagonist can do stuff and a heroic protagonist can do a lot of stuff. But in protocol fiction, the system does a lot of stuff, right? Like in Foundation, the Harry Seldon's vault is on like a clock and it just opens up at various times and affects the story. Yeah, I don't know if that's what Tom meant, but yeah, there's something there.
It's kind of like the Bechdel test to see like how much conversation there is.
Maybe that's actually I'm going to put this in as a candidate. So Tom, if you feel like modifying, you can come and edit this, but I'm going to capture this as something like, you know, a Bechdel test, which is agency in system greater than agency in, and I'm going to put this in scare quotes, protagonist. Because you're right, there's the whole, in the second comment by Tom, he says the whole word protagonist is kind of sus, and I kind of agree. Okay, so this is a candidate rule that maybe we can vote on, but yeah, that brings us to 7. Do we have any other questions? Maybe we can do one more if there are any.
Yeah, just a quick question about how much literature we're considering outside of the West and Western cinema.
Yeah, this is, so we do have a strong Chinese track in the program, and last year we had Kifan's talk. So setting aside the translation problem, I think, yeah, there's a lot of potential. Like I think a lot of Korean dramas and movies are very protocolish. Like the premises and execution are very protocolish. Like a Squid Game is kind of protocolish reality TV. But yeah, we kind of have to get more systematic about this, because I do think there's a lot more out there, especially historical. Like if you look at, I was just thinking about this, like, you know, the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, that's like, you know, a frame story and recursive stories within stories. That's kind of protocolish fiction. So there's a lot like that out there. But yeah, so we would like to invite a lot more people to write for Protocolized and maybe contribute to this Rome graph and flesh out the non-Western part of protocol fiction.
Yeah, definitely. If anybody has any recommendations, send them in. Thanks, Travis and Sachin, for joining us. Venkat, any closing thoughts? Why?
Just
Kick these
repeating
writers off
the
the stage.
invitation, join the Discord. I think I've already posted the link to this room. read what we have, and if you want to like join the project, just DM me on Discord and with your email, and I'll add you to the graph. Like, we don't want to open it up fully immediately, but yeah, if you're interested, join in.
Okay, I'll do my closing spiel, and thanks guys for joining. Thanks everybody for joining. The next talk's with Nadia Asparova, who was a alumni of the SOP 23 cohort, who wrote an essay titled Dangerous Protocols. She's also publishing a new book called Antimemetics, Why Some Ideas Don't Spread. We'll talk about both those things next week at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So tune in live for a great conversation with a very talented author. Yeah, see you later.